The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 began a mass social experiment in collective ownership, the suppression of organized religion, and intolerance of pluralism, which continued until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1900s. The Soviet experiment was enforced by the governing executive, or Politburo, formed from the Communist Party, which exercised arbitrary power through policing agencies. For several decades after the revolution, opposition party members, activists, trade unionists, and dissidents were summarily executed, judicially murdered, or sent to a network of Siberian prison camps, the infamous Gulag, whenever they came to the attention of the authorities. Enemies of the Soviet leadership who fled abroad were tracked down and killed. With the death of Stalin in 1953, the regime began taking the arguably more lenient approach to dissent of committing its critics to psychiatric hospitals rather than the Gulag, where they could be treated for their eccentric, political, personality disorders by state-employed doctors. Artistic expression was perceived as a threat to power, and even well-intentioned artists, dramatists, and composers risked their work being misinterpreted as satire or subversion. Socialist realism was encouraged, which portrayed a strong, healthy, happy population of workers basking in the personality cult of leadership by a committee of icons. The Bolshevik leader, Vladimir Lenin, described religion as the opium of the people, used for the stupefaction of the working class. Fascism originated in 1920s Italy under Benito Mussolini and established a second 20th century form of totalitarian one-party state, though one in which private ownership of capital, subject to arbitrary regulation, was encouraged, and a simple Catholic Church allowed to continue its ministry of the fascist faithful. Criticism and dissent were dealt with harshly, but in theory, so was private sector organised crime, leading to a decadent utopia for oligarchs and efficient state-directed full employment for the proletariat, which contrasted with and emphatically opposed the perceived universal oppression of aspiration and spirituality by Soviet communism. The word fascism is derived from a bundle of similar sticks, which have strength through unity as they fit together homogeneously. This strength has traditionally been wielded against the weak and inhomogeneous. Fascism is notoriously intolerant of minorities perceived as inferior because of race, political beliefs, sexual orientation, physical disability, and mental deficiency. Fascist societies are usually patriarchal, with women confined to domestic roles. Fascist patriots proclaim they serve the fatherland, whereas communist patriots serve the motherland. Traditional artistic expression is encouraged, and modern or experimental art, the avant-garde, is condemned as degenerate. For Italians, traditional meant Christian themes in the style of the Renaissance. For Germans, the themes were often nationalistic allegories depicted through the images of Germanic or classic paganism in the style of 19th century Romanticism. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, German fascists and communists fought, quite literally, for the control of their country. And in the 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag, though without an overall majority. It was enough, in the face of fragmented opposition, for Hitler to conspire his way to the chancellorship and the exercise of arbitrary power. Unchecked by an effective parliamentary opposition or independent judiciary, the Nazis were quickly able to Nazify the public sector and enmesh society with their ideology. Kristallnacht was a pogrom carried out by organised vigilante groups and police, though authorised by the government ministries. Discretionary power to break the law, conducted less than a year before Germany embarked upon a medieval war of conquest and a policy of genocide which is beyond rational comprehension. Trade unions were assumed to be organised by Moscow and therefore anathema to many Germans, as was the presence of Untermenschen in their society. Denunciation became a national pastime. History suggests that in the 1930s and 40s, Germany was populated by a higher proportion of bourgeois and proletarian psychopaths than the European average, with a pathological proclivity to be led by and slavishly serve thuggish demagogues. The reparation demands of the Versailles Treaty, which the Nazis repudiated, and the harsh economic conditions of the early 1930s, which the Nazis appeared to redress, are cited as mitigating factors in the adoration of such brutal nationalistic cult. Is the economy stupid, rich and large in retrospect? A second mitigating factor could be the risk of denunciation, which accompanied even passive dissent. Video surveillance in modern states can be used to identify those who fail to clap and cheer the leadership in their homes, offices, and at conferences and rallies. Woo! Winston Churchill famously suggested that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others, although even he made admiring remarks about the efficiency of fascism in the early 1930s. He quickly recognized the threat to peace posed by Nazi Germany, however, when many of his fellow conservatives wanted to see a strong Germany oppose the Soviet Union and thus defend Western capitalism. Francisco Franco presided over a fascist regime in Spain from 1939 until his death in 1975, after which the country transitioned to democracy. In the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, Franco's nationalist rebels were supported by the Catholic Church, Hitler, Mussolini, and controversially the British Royal Navy. Though sympathetic to the Republican government, France adhered to non-intervention for fear of conflict with the Axis powers, and because Britain was inclined towards Franco, leaving Moscow as the sole sponsor of the Republicans. Idealists, intellectuals, and adventurers, such as the writers Ernest Hemingway and George Orwell, travelled from the United States and Britain to Spain as journalists, or to join the international brigades which resisted the inevitable nationalist triumph, though Orwell gradually became disillusioned with the factious, murderous left-wing groups purporting to support the Republican government. The Spanish Civil War and its aftermath were characterized by terrible atrocities, which continued until the defeat of Axis powers in 1945. Spanish expatriates in occupied France were deported back to Spain, in some cases for execution. The painter and critic of Franco, Pablo Picasso, was perhaps fortunate to have been kept under house arrest in Paris by the Gestapo, which was almost redolent of the heretical Martin Luther, saved from Catholic Inquisition by a North German prince 4 centuries earlier. Or perhaps the politically circumspect Franco thought it expedient not to request his return. There is some debate over whether the Franco regime should be categorized as fascist, or merely authoritarian, as if the distinction would matter to its victims. Right-wing Catholic nationalists and vehemently anti-communists would be accurate, the latter quality perhaps preserving the regime through most of the Cold War. The targets of the state were perceived political opponents rather than ethnic or religious groups, although Jews and Protestants were liable to persecution by Catholic clergy, which was used as a policing agency. The Inquisition had been abolished in 1834, 5 years after the emancipation of English Catholics, but experienced a revival of sorts under Franco, who was not considered to be religious. The case of Franco is instructive in that he lived out his natural lifespan as a brutal dictator, though not quite on the scale of Stalin, who ruled an empire of several 100 million, but who also died of natural causes while still in power. Unlike Hitler and Mussolini, Franco did not engage in the sort of foreign policy adventures, beginning with the aerial bombing of Abyssinia, which eventually brought about their downfall. Instead, he became an ally of the United States when President Eisenhower sought a Mediterranean naval base on the Iberian Peninsula. On June the 22nd, 1941, just 2 days from the anniversary of Napoleon crossing the Niemen River in 1812, fascism embarked upon an apocalyptic conquest of communism in the East, whilst engaged in a proxy war with the quasi-liberal United States for the Atlantic island of Great Britain in the West. The fatherland of Karl Marx battled with the motherland of Marxist-Leninism in a titanic clash of mechanized steel cavalry, rolling over grounds trodden by the boots and hooves of warlords throughout Eastern European history. After crossing the Russian steppe with spectacular success, the panzers were halted within sight of Moscow's golden spires by the onset of the Russian winter in 1941 and defeated at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-3. A protracted conflict then ensued, without precedent in human history for its ferocity and destruction, which eventually drove the fascists back to Berlin. Communism finally triumphed over fascism in the northeastern corner of Germany, which fell to the Red Army of the Soviet Union in May 1945. The initial occupation was a brutal reprisal, though not comparable with Nazi plans for the Russian clearances. Administration passed to German puppets, taking instructions from Moscow, most famous perhaps being the hardliner Erich Honecker, whom Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev appointed in 1971, and who did not resign until the communist Gotterdammerung of 1989. A paradox of the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, or simply East Germany, is that it applied almost the same Teutonic zeal to the business of communism as it had to fascism. The East German army and police were viewed as formidable and effective, assisted by the popular predilection for denunciation. The word Stasi, derived from the East German Ministry for State Security, has become a noun which is synonymous the world over with secret policing. As the business of international public relations expanded in the 1970s, the Stasi became notorious for their covert methods and deniable crimes, which were well documented by human rights journalists. The Stasi manual has since been studied and selectively applied by undercover British police officers, authorised by the Home Secretary to commit Stasi-style crimes against dissident artists and critics of the Conservative Party, using the best digital technology available. However, East Germany laboured under the same competitive disadvantages of all such command economies, and was impoverished by harsh reparations imposed by the Soviets for World War II. The population declined by about 20% in the course of its 45-year history, as many people, especially free-thinking academics and technicians, fled illegally to the then liberal West. A communist police state could not exist indefinitely so geographically close to the capitalist sphere of influence. After the digital communications revolutions had begun, despite the opinions of naysaying experts and distinguished columnists, right up until its eventual collapse, which was brought about by a pressure wave of aspirant emigration. A corollary is that dictators, once ensconced in modern technological societies, are very difficult to dislodge from power by domestic opposition alone. A stark warning to those who are complacent about the dissolution of civil liberties in the UK as the centenary for the Representation of the People's Act 1918 approaches. For most stations in British society, the franchise is still less than a century old, and class divisions are beginning to widen again, with the proletariat facing jeopardy from the government's domestic video surveillance operations, which the wealthy can guard against by purchasing electronic countermeasures and court hearings. Most communist systems, excepting those imposed externally, were established through violent revolt against absolute monarchical or colonial rule in societies without a liberal philosophical tradition. Fascism may be regarded as an extreme reaction to communism, which denies human beings the right to private ownership of capital and suppresses organised religion. Although communist communities since the 19th century have tended to be more egalitarian and inclusive with regard to ethnic minorities and women, Soviet doctrine suppressed the anti-Semitism and nationalist tensions of Imperial Russia after the Civil War post-1922, as did Tito's socialist dictatorship of Yugoslavia after World War II. Mussolini suppressed the Sicilian mafia, police states, reduce crime and make communities safer. But at what cost? Fascism and communism share the disturbing characteristics of being single-party police states, in contrast to the once liberal democracy of the United Kingdom, whose economic success rose from a system of laws which protect persons and property from the predation of the executive. The demands of powerful baronial and entrepreneurial mercantile classes for protection in law from the arbitrary power of sovereign monarchs led to the unexpected consequence of civil liberties for the masses and the right to organise into labour unions. Such laws were formulated and preserved through political pluralism and an open system of justice until the digital revolution created an alternative, secretive, parallel, competing jurisdiction, policed using the techniques and rules of Cold War espionage, in which the historic axioms of law protecting persons and property no longer apply. Political activists in the United Kingdom are gradually coming to realise, and in some cases accept, the degree to which they are being spied upon. The ancient right of parliamentary privilege has been abolished, de facto, in the manner of legal privilege, without much protest. Those who experience this most acutely belong to fringe parties which lack influence or patronage, are never likely to exercise ministerial power, and who represent radical opinion, but the sense of national paranoia will spread and eventually become part of being British, just as it was a German characteristic under Hitler and Honecker. Towards the end of World War II, the Observer newspaper published a piece by George Orwell in which he wrote, "The essential fact about a totalitarian regime is that it has no laws. People are not punished for specific offences, but because they are considered to be politically or intellectually undesirable." Free market liberal economics and liberal democracy evolve concurrently, but as the disunited kingdom becomes a right-wing socialist single-party state, with the majority of voters beholden to the government for employment and benefits, so the once sacrosanct legal imperatives of modern history are being abandoned expediently, like a defunct liturgy post-Reformation. With Weimar-style complacency, the United Kingdom Parliament in the digital age has inexplicably gifted the Home Secretary all the arbitrary power necessary to set aside its historic laws, which protect persons and property from the decree of the executive and its cadre of undercover secret police. The laws of liberal democracy, which millions fought and died to defend in world wars against fascism, and then 4 decades thereafter risked nuclear annihilation to preserve from communism, are now inconvenient to, and therefore under threat from, those who control the post-liberal digital state.